Well, hi Dan. Thank you for joining me this afternoon, or for you this morning, to speak to us for the ACADEM and QACE Knowledge Bar on this year's first edition that we bring out, where we have articles and topics evolving around sustainability in higher education. Now, you got me in a bit of a dilemma when I was preparing this interview for this afternoon. I was thinking, okay, how am I going to introduce Dan as someone who everyone seems to know in higher education, in the business school community that we're part of, right? With everything you've been doing over the past years, you're being a great networker, you've been very active. So I was thinking, if I introduce you, or when I introduce you, that may I actually need to introduce you since everyone seems to know you, but when I do, actually, I would probably have to spend the whole time we have for this interview just speaking about everything you've been doing. So I'll leave it at that, and I hope this already shows some appreciation for everything you've been doing. But one thing I realized is also when I was looking at that is that we're more or less reaching your 3-year, or just have reached your 3-year anniversary as CEO of GBSN, right?
That's it,
So,
3 years. Almost, yeah. What's today, the 11th?
Yeah.
Tomorrow. Yeah. Tomorrow is my 3-year anniversary.
Perfect timing then, isn't it?
Yeah, it's, it's amazing. It's, as everyone has already calculated in their heads, that's 2/3 of that under the heavy weight of COVID-19. And all of us have been dealing with that in some way or another. And, all I could say is the second 2 years were very different than the first year, but all very good at GBSN. We're growing, we're making progress as an organization and making a bigger impact. So it's been great. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. Well, and impact obviously being one of those keywords and buzzwords that we hear a lot these days in higher education, next to sustainability. For those of us not listening in that may not be too familiar with the work of GBSN, do you mind sharing a bit, what is it that you do with GBSN?
I'd be happy to, and at the same time address that first point that you raised. Why is sustainability important to the Global Business School Network? We were started about 18 years ago by the International Finance Corporation, part of the World Bank, and specifically because they thought a lot of money going into international development, into emerging economies, was underproductive. And the reason was leadership, management, entrepreneurship not being as effective as it could be. So they wanted to do something about that. They gathered a small set of business schools, which became the founding set of business schools for the Global Business School Network, and started to work on that opportunity. And we were quickly spun out and are separate 501c3. We're a DC-based nonprofit. So if you think about that mission today, I could talk a little bit about me coming on board and what that meant for the Global Business School Network and the way we do our work. But if you sort of map that against the sustainability question that you raised, the ideas at the time, I'm sure much of the discussion was more typically about economic development, job creation, sort of capitalistic view about what generates growth in an economy. But today, obviously, well, perhaps not obviously, but for us, it's not just about economic growth, it's about more inclusive and sustainable development. And so a large part of what we do at GBSN now includes, how do we think differently about management education? Mm-hmm. How do we think differently about our research and our outreach in the communities in a way that generates more inclusive, again, and sustainable development?
Mm-hmm. And in that work that you do, obviously you have a very broad network of schools, right? I was just looking at the members again, and you really have members in all parts of the world. Now, trying to stay in touch during those times of pandemic, with everything that's been going on, how much of a challenge has that been? And have you seen differences in how schools within the network have been affected during these times?
Yeah. So the answer to the first question, I think, like many of the folks who will be listening or viewing this video cast, it's been a challenge for all organizations to adapt. For some, it was easier than others, right? If you already have a good base of virtual work, it was easier. And for us, that was the case. Much of our work, being global, was already on or virtual, in the sense of making a difference, not necessarily having to be there. But I think for us, it also created a number of opportunities, just like for many business schools. For us, it was we started to focus on two things: being more inclusive than we would have otherwise been. The great part about virtual is it enables that kind of inclusivity globally. And that's, so we, for example, we worked hard in the last year to support schools in Papua New Guinea, which was in the past not on the map, so to speak, in the kinds of things that we do, but it was largely virtual. But for us, it's enabled growth. And more importantly, it's enabled us to expand our impact in many ways that we couldn't have otherwise done. I'll get to perhaps some of those examples, but by now I've forgotten the first part of your question. Maybe you could repeat it for me, or the second part of your question, Axel.
Mm-hmm. Well, the second part being is like, do you see differences in regions or areas or within the network, how schools have been affected by the pandemic, maybe in different ways or all the same?
Yeah. Oh boy, this is a really important dimension of GBS, and our mission formally is to improve access to quality, locally relevant management education. And the thing about COVID is that it's affected us all, but the way we've experienced COVID and addressed COVID has been very different depending on the communities, the region, the infrastructure, and things like that. And we don't need to go into all the stories, but for example, with GBSN, obviously, developing countries and least developed countries are very important to us. And as everybody knows, their experience with vaccines has been very different than the experience in where you are, Axel. I think in Germany now, where I'm in the US. And that's important. We were founded, and when you think about it, on the belief that management business is contextual. And that's why we talk so much at GBSN about experiential learning, for example, and peer-to-peer learning, because that brings in the context in a real and meaningful way, in addition to, of course, our work in creating locally relevant cases, so that the students, learners can have the opportunity to learn from, for example, Nigerian businesses when you're learning in Nigeria.
As you mentioned those examples just now with the differences of some schools, something that for me came to mind also is coming back to that topic of sustainability. Sustainability often obviously being linked to the climate crisis we currently see. And one thing I recently saw in a documentary of Fridays for Future, being a global community in many, many countries, but then seeing how some of the regional communities of Fridays for Future in certain regions having a tough time putting that matter of the climate crisis on everybody's radar, simply because people are struggling as is with so many different topics in their region, in their communities, that you often hear that narrative of we cannot afford that. And I sometimes feel like we have that same challenge in higher education, that there are regions in the world where the investment in education may be seen as something we cannot simply afford. It's seen as a luxury. So do you mind expanding a bit on how do you experience those kind of challenges, and how is GBSN tackling that or supporting schools with that?
Yeah, there's a lot to your question. I'll try to break it up in pieces, maybe ask you a couple of questions in the process, perhaps. But so let me address sort of the opening a little bit. I've always believed that if we're going to address challenges like climate change, if you take the whole group of SDGs, for example, there are two things. One is global leadership, and the second is local initiative. And I think that there's still a chance for global leadership, but there was a period where I thought we were not getting any global leadership. And so I have my hat hung on local initiative, right? That we could address these issues from the ground up in communities around the world. Now, the question is, how do we enable and empower them to do that? And that's largely the work of the Global Business School Network. I mean, when you think about what I mentioned before, our mission, locally relevant management, education, and leadership, we're empowering people to not just do business, but to change the way we do business in a way that is more inclusive and more sustainable. Now, the question of how, this is the grand challenge. What you bring up is sort of the grand challenge in higher education, in education in general, right? So how do you do things that work, that are effective? How do you do education that actually works and is accessible, right? We can always think of examples, MOOCs, for example. MOOCs are very accessible, but one can debate whether or not they work in particular contexts, especially since most of the professors delivering these have experiences mostly that are in the global north, in more developed countries, right? And how do you contextualize that? On the other hand, we could think of many examples. I believe strongly in the Harvard Business School model, right? It works, right? But it's hardly accessible, right? So this is the fundamental challenge. And so we think there's a role for technology, but we also always embed this set of ideas related to peer-to-peer learning, experiential learning. We spend a lot of time developing locally relevant case studies and simulations that serve to fill this gap, I would say, in our ability to deliver and empower people locally.
Mm-hmm. Looking a bit further on that notion of sustainability, I mean, obviously, we quite often hear the term in terms of the climate crisis or climate protection, renewable energies, etc. But obviously, that is just a tiny area of what sustainability entails. Now, in terms of the business school context and getting the next generation of graduates going out there to supposedly change or hopefully change the world for the better, like in that context, what does sustainability entail for you? How would you define it in that context personally?
Yeah, I may be misinterpreting your question, but I think that there are a couple of things worth bringing together in response to that question. Maybe a slight deviation. I once visited a new medical school, the Dell Medical School, and the reason why I visited is they said that our role is to graduate physicians that change the healthcare system, not just go to work in it, right? And I think if you think about our role in business schools, we've often, I think, historically thought our job was to graduate MBA students, for example, not just MBA students, that go out and work in the existing system. But I think now we recognize that our job is not only that, but to graduate people that are capable of changing the system. But the word system itself, I think, is very important to draw on in response to your question. I think too often we've thought of business in a vacuum, right? That our role, whether it be through research or through education, is specifically related to business. But today, and in fact, I would argue it's always been the case that you can't separate business from the context society. You need to think of business education at the nexus between business, government, and civil society. and that understanding the larger systemic challenges in our industry or in business is very important. You know, I used to say something in my previous organization, I still say it at GBSN, and I think it's true now increasingly for business educators. I used to say my role at GBSN is not just to lead an organization, but to lead an industry. And I think that as we think about what we do with graduates, what we do ourselves as educators is similar, right? If I'm a dean of a business school, my job is not just to lead a school, it's to lead change in industry, business education, and more broadly in business and society.
Mm. Do you sometimes maybe see the risk that when we actually look at the individual schools, then trying to adapt that, trying to take that to heart, that quite often we stop at just putting something on our websites, putting something on the program brochures of what students are going to learn, but then we actually face the challenges in trying to truly embed that into our own schools, into the programs, etc. Sort of similar in a way how we have that, what's often referred to as greenwashing in businesses pretending to be sustainable without really being sustainable. Do you see similar tendencies or barriers of resistance?
You know, it's a fair question, but perhaps this is more a reflection on who I am than on the reality. But you know, what I see in business schools, especially in our work at GBSN, is a genuine desire. Now, the reality may be very different than we think, but there's a genuine desire to back the words up with action. But I do think it's hard, and it has been hard. You know, often, you know, I've been involved with the sustainability, call it a movement or set of changes, transformation, for many years. I was involved in the early stages of the Principles for Responsible Management Education when I was at AACSB. I served on the steering committee for many years, served as chair, worked with organizations like GRLI, even from the start back in 2002, long time ago, right? And obviously with my work at AACSB, I hope led to even some more recent changes that are important. What I think is that sometimes we discount our ability in business schools. We often talk about, you know, future leaders as an example, which is great, right? We're educating future leaders, change the curriculum, et cetera. Research, right? We want to generate insights that enable businesses to make a bigger difference in sustainability, sustainable development. But we sometimes forget that business schools are large, very powerful institutions of, you know, students that care deeply about the environment, for example, faculty that want to change the world, and leaders that really believe strongly in business education. We don't often think of that power to make a difference right now through the outreach, the engagement activities that we're doing. So, and that's a lot of what we're doing at GBSN. We run a humanitarian logistics challenge. We had groups of students all over the world last year working on trying to build more resilient communities in the face of disaster, right? So, you know, let's put the students, the faculty, the leaders to work right now, not just think about them in the future. So I think we discount our ability. Sometimes we don't stretch ourselves. We don't think beyond our organizations enough about the opportunities that we can create, especially when we work together to generate collective action.
Mm. Yeah, I totally agree. What I was just thinking of is, and you mentioned the SDGs before, that comment of we're discounting our abilities. I think what we quite often feel like in situations like these, right? The beginning of the 21st century, that seems to be just crisis after crisis, right? We had the financial crisis, the Euro crisis, we have a pandemic, we have wars going on, we have the climate crisis and so forth. It seems to be all just crises. but then sometimes we really lack that focus on, okay, there's actually been improvements since the SDGs have been developed, and counting the KPIs that have been set up. So that there is good news in there. But looking at now maybe just the last 2 years of total pandemic, what is it, or has there been any story in there, anything that you've been working on where you said, okay, this is giving me hope that in the next few years we're making more steps in the right direction?
Yes. First of all, there's a book I'd like to recommend. He's unfortunately passed away now. Hans Rosling, with I think it's his daughter and son-in-law, I may have that backwards, wrote a book called Factfulness. And if I recommend for anyone interested in your first question to take a look, and it does help us to understand, I think, in many ways, the progress that we've made over a span of time that goes beyond my limited memory, right? So I do recommend that. And yes, one of the things I've really appreciated about my work at GBSN, a friend of mine told me, when I was at AACSB for nearly 20 years, most of my work was with things that didn't come naturally to an accrediting body, right? A lot of it was trying to generate innovation, really trying to push hard on the sustainable development. There was a lot of points to that. Even the knowledge work that I did at times seemed to conflict with, in some people's minds, the accreditation process. So there's a lot of things. So I spent a couple of decades working or swimming against the stream, right? Against the flow. And that's wearing out. It wears out anybody, right? But with GBSN, what I've appreciated most is that the schools that we work with, they join GBSN because they want to pursue the mission of GBSN. So we're all working together in a wider ecosystem. So we're part of our network now includes Deutsche Post DHL. We're working on programs to support SMEs in a pilot program in Cameroon, Uganda, Colombia, and Ecuador. Working with a Pan-African bank on a women's leadership program. We're all working on the same set of challenges, and that has put me, I realize I'm in a privileged position, but has put me in a position to say, yeah, there's not only lots of hope, I think we're going to be able to do this. We're going to be able to put business education in a stronger leadership role when it comes to sustainable development.
As you mentioned, accreditation and background, obviously not just AAC people, but accreditation in general, may it be international accreditations, but also may it be national requirements. Do you sometimes see that as a potential limiting factor in creating those kind of programs? Because, I mean, all the examples you've been giving, they sound like really amazing programs that have been very creative and innovative in setting them up, and sort of something, say, off the beaten path of a classic business degree in a sense, right? Maybe it's usually that, or sometimes they're part of it, but maybe it's something out of it, your natural business school degree program. Do you sometimes see that in developing those kind of programs where you say, okay, look, we actually have certain requirements that may be in the way of what we're trying to set up here? Or are they actually a good enough framework in supporting those kind of programs?
Yeah, it's let me address the question this way. I think historically, in the past, I should say, not historically, in the past, I think that was an easy question to answer in the sense of, yeah, I think that the way accreditation worked in the past, and even if not explicitly in terms of the standards and the processes, at least implicitly in terms of the tacit understandings, I think did limit the ability of schools to change and develop in ways that are necessary to be a stronger proponent of business as a force for good. But I think all that's changed, I have the most experience with AACSB, of course, but EFMD was a leader way back in Bangkok. I remember in issuing a manifesto that led to the Globally Responsible Leadership Initiative. I think, AACSB especially, but not only with the most recent standards, has really made a difference in opening up not only, again, the explicit, but I think the mindset to say, look, it's okay to move outside the boundaries of what business schools are normally thought to do. It's okay to do it a little differently, engaging different kinds of faculty and generating research that, may not go through the usual channels. I was on the judging panel for the recent FT Awards for research impact. Mm-hmm. And we learned so much just from that experience. I did, at least. But one of the things is that, look, the set of journals we normally think of publishing in business weren't necessarily the same journals that the winners were publishing in, right? And not only that, I think it's fair to say that journals are not necessarily the only vehicle through which we do this. In fact, I think one challenge in business education has not been the accreditation process, but the system we created for rewarding and recognizing research in our industry. It's, faculty members in business schools often had this mindset, look, I published your journal, right? I move on to the next one, right? Where in reality, it's just the beginning. When you think about it, how do we think about our work in action, our insights in action?
Mm-hmm. On that note, and trying to sort of sum up what we've been speaking about, sustainability in higher ed, in our business school community, and obviously and I can only stress that again, and not enough, your vast experience in recent years with all those organizations. What piece of advice would you give out to deans who may see themselves in their schools at the moment at crossroads where they're challenged to put sustainability more at the core of their programs at their organizations? What would you leave them with?
Well, this perhaps isn't a 30-second answer, but, actually I could, really neat books just been published, edited by Santiago Niguez at IE University, who I think many of us and who'll be watching this know, and Peter Laranche, who many of us have known for a long time as well. I wrote a chapter on there, and the title of the chapter is Business Schools as Catalysts for Sustainable Development. And in there, I gave 5 suggestions. That's why I said I'm a little worried about how much time it'll take me to answer this question. But I won't go through each one in detail, but the 5 things were, number one was, which I think we all believe strongly in now, is to articulate purpose. Business schools, this fellow Deepak Jain, the venerable Deepak Jain is always, or used to say that business schools had put performance over purpose, right? We were always so focused on being a great business school that we sometimes forgot about why we exist, and really beginning to articulate our role in our communities is pretty important. So I always start with that. But I also encourage to think about diversity and research, where I see schools succeeding more is when they recognize that we all don't need to be the same kind of scholar, that there's breadth that matters, and there's different roles for different kinds of people in connecting with business practice. I say, instead of just thinking about teaching and research, think about the opportunities to act now and to engage your people in the communities that you serve more deeply, and solving challenges even right now. Going back to your original question, Axel, one of the recommendations there is empower local initiative, especially nowadays. I think the work with SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, because of the way technology is changing, their role in international trade and their ability to make a difference is expanding significantly. And so really focusing on your backyard, to me, is really an important part of this. And then finally, as I've emphasized throughout, connect across sectors. Don't think your role is restricted to business schools, but rather think about the role of government and the importance of management within the government context, but think about the kinds of things that you can do to connect government, civil society, and business. Those are the 5 suggestions. I recommend that you buy the book, download the chapter, whatever you need to do. Ping me, I'll send you a copy, no worries. But you know, there are lots of things that I think we could do. But you know, going back to a point I made earlier, one thing I always suggest to deans, and this is something Paul Pullman emphasizes in his work previously at Unilever. If you read his book, Net Positive, is that really, in order to make a difference, in order to address sustainability, we have to think beyond our organizations. You know, and we have to lead development beyond our own organizations. You know, sometimes it's hard to reconcile that with the competitive dimension, but think of it as pre-competitive work, right? We'll still compete to attract the best students and the best faculty. But in the end, if we build platforms that bring us together in ways that help us to solve these important challenges, we'll be making a huge difference.
And for that, obviously, we do have GBSN as a great platform, or one of the platforms enabling that. So thank you for sharing that thing, and thank you for taking the time this afternoon. It was great catching up with you, and we'll put the details on the book and your chapter in the notes below, so people can easily find that and make sure we get everyone to read that. So thank you for taking the time, Dan.
Thank you for that, and thank you for having me here. It's been a pleasure catching up with you, but also talking about something that we care deeply about. All of us who are listening or watching this video care deeply about.